Body Knows, Episode 13, Emotional Flashbacks Without Images. Hello, and welcome back to The Body Knows. Today we enter one of the most elusive yet universal experiences of trauma, emotional flashbacks without images. Most of us know what a flashback looks like from film or media. A war veteran ducking at fireworks, a survivor suddenly seeing vivid pictures of what they went through. But for many, perhaps most, flashbacks don't arrive with pictures. They arrive as feelings, a sudden wave of despair in the middle of an ordinary conversation. Rage that erupts out of nowhere, shocking even yourself. An overwhelming sense of shame, dread, or abandonment with no image attached. These are emotional flashbacks, the body remembering without words or pictures. And here's the key: when the body remembers this way, it doesn't feel like memory. It feels like now. Why emotional flashbacks matter. Emotional flashbacks are often misunderstood, even in clinical settings. Without visual images, people assume what they feel is irrational, overreactive, or defective. But neuroscience shows otherwise. Traumatic memory is fragmented. The hippocampus, the brain's archivist, struggles under stress, failing to encode memory in sequence. The amygdala, the alarm system of the brain, stores raw emotional charge. When triggered later, it floods the system with cortisol and adrenaline without handing over the accompanying story. The result? A person relives terror, rage, grief, not as recollection, but as raw effect. This is why someone can feel despair in a safe conversation, or rage during a small disagreement. The body isn't misbehaving, it's remembering. Linking back to trauma loops. In our last episode, we explored how trauma loops collapse time. Emotional flashbacks are one of the most intimate expressions of this collapse. They show how the past enters the present not through images, but through sensation and feeling. Where visual flashbacks say, "I'm seeing it again," emotional flashbacks say, "I'm feeling it again." Both override context. Both leave the survivor asking, "What's wrong with me?" The truth is, nothing is wrong with you. Your body is working exactly as trauma taught it to. Why no images? It's natural to ask, why do some flashbacks lack images? Research shows that under high stress, the hippocampus, responsible for contextual memory, shuts down. The amygdala and limbic system keep firing, recording raw survival data, fear, rage, dread. These emotional imprints survive even when narrative detail doesn't. Think of it like a book torn apart in a storm. The pictures and words are gone, but the ink-stained paper remains. That paper is feeling. It survives even when the storyline doesn't. An invitation to reflection. Before we move deeper, pause with me for a moment. Have you ever felt an emotion that seemed too big for the moment? Have you ever wondered why a small disagreement triggered enormous rage, or why a passing comment sent you into despair that felt bottomless? These may have been emotional flashbacks, memories without pictures, but with all the force of the past. You are not weak for feeling them. You are not irrational. You are living with a body that carries memory differently. My own connection. For me, emotional flashbacks have often been the hardest to name. When I've had meltdowns or shutdowns, people could at least see something happening. But when despair or mistrust flooded me in quiet moments without cause, I thought I was broken. It wasn't until later, through my own self-development and spiritual work, that I realized these were echoes of childhood, surfacing without images. My nervous system was still carrying imprints of times I felt abandoned, shamed, or unsafe. The story was gone, but the feeling was alive. Naming them as flashbacks changed everything. It gave me compassion for myself. It gave me language where there had only been silence. Today, we'll explore emotional flashbacks from every angle. We'll look at the physiology, cortisol, the vagus nerve, the limbic system, and why feelings surface without images. We'll walk through scenarios of despair and rage, tracing how the nervous system floods in real time. We'll consider philosophy and culture, from Augustine's reflections on memory to Buddhist and modern theories of affect. I'll share personal reflections from my own childhood to adult experiences. And we'll close with practices, ways of grounding, naming, and separating past threat from present context. By the end, I hope that you'll not only understand emotional flashbacks better, but also feel less alone in them. You'll see they are not signs of weakness, but signs of a body that survived, because the body remembers, even when the mind cannot see. Let's begin the physiology of emotional flashbacks. When the body remembers without pictures, the process can feel mysterious, almost supernatural. One moment you're speaking calmly with someone, and the next your chest tightens, your stomach drops, and despair or rage floods you. There is no obvious cause in the present. No image appears in your mind, and yet your whole body is convinced something terrible is happening. To understand this, we need to follow the nervous system step by step. The brain's alarm system, amygdala overdrive. At the heart of emotional flashbacks lies the amygdala, a small almond-shaped structure deep in the limbic system. Its job is simple: detect a threat. When the amygdala senses danger, or even a cue that resembles past danger, it overrides higher reasoning. It shouts, "Act now," before the prefrontal cortex can say, "Wait, let's think." In trauma, the amygdala becomes sensitized. Sounds, tones of voice, facial expressions, and even body posture can trigger it. The body reacts as if the past danger is here again. This is why a gentle disagreement can feel like life or death. The amygdala does not distinguish between then and now. The hippocampus and the collapse of context normally, the hippocampus works alongside the amygdala to create context. It says, yes, this feels like danger, but look, we are safe now. This is only a conversation, not a past event. But under traumatic stress, the hippocampus falters. High levels of cortisol damage its ability to sequence memory. Instead of filing the past neatly in the archive, it drops shards of emotion without date or time. Later, when a trigger arrives, those emotional shards surface without narrative. This is why emotional flashbacks lack images. The hippocampus didn't store the full picture. The amygdala stored only the raw charge. Cortisol and the flood of stress cortisol, the primary stress hormone, plays a central role. When the amygdala alarms, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal HPA axis floods the body with cortisol. This cascade has real physical effects. Heart rate accelerates, muscles tense, digestion slows, the immune system alters. These are survival adaptations: fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. But when the threat is only a trigger, the body endures this storm unnecessarily. And because there is no conscious memory attached, the person feels inexplicably broken, anxious, or enraged. The vagus nerve and shutdown, the vagus nerve, central to the parasympathetic nervous system, determines whether we feel safe enough to connect or need to protect. When emotional flashbacks strike, the vagus nerve often shifts into defense. In some people, this means sympathetic activation, fight or flight. In others, it means dorsal vagal shutdown, collapse, numbness, silence. This is why emotional flashbacks can look so different. One person lashes out in anger, another goes mute and withdrawn. Both are nervous system responses to a remembered threat. Why feelings survive without images. From a neurological standpoint, feelings often outlast images because they are encoded differently. Sensory and emotional data are stored quickly in survival mode. Narrative and visual detail require calm, oxygen-rich brain states to consolidate. In trauma, survival trumps narrative. The amygdala imprints terror, shame, rage. The hippocampus, overwhelmed, fails to integrate detail. The prefrontal cortex, offline, can't rationalize. A result, a body that carries unstoried emotions. Scenario, the trigger without context. Imagine you're speaking with a friend. They raise their voice slightly, not in anger but in emphasis. In a fraction of a second, your amygdala recognizes something familiar. Perhaps the tone echoes a parent's anger from childhood. The hippocampus, however, has no filed memory to clarify. This is not then. Cortisol floods, your stomach knots, your throat tightens, your mind races to catch up. Why am I suddenly so afraid? Why do I want to leave? But there's no image, no memory to hold on to. Only the body screaming, danger. This is the anatomy of an emotional flashback. The limbic system, as time machine scientists sometimes describe the limbic system as a time machine. Not because it travels into the future, but because it collapses past and present. When the amygdala activates and the hippocampus fails to contextualize, the limbic system pushes unprocessed emotions into now. The body is transported, not visually but somatically, into the past. This is why survivors often say, it felt real, it felt current, it felt like I was there again. The body doesn't distinguish between a flashback and reality. Personal reflection, my body without pictures. For me, emotional flashbacks often arrived as mistrust. I'd sit with people, friends or partners, and suddenly feel cold, withdrawn. I didn't see an image of the past, but I felt the same old abandonment and betrayal I knew as a child. Other times, it built slowly. I'd already been carrying tension, already trying to signal that I was struggling. I would make it known in small ways, withdrawing, becoming quieter, even speaking directly about what I needed. But when those wants, desires, or needs were dismissed or ignored, it became the final blow. That's when the pressure inside me erupted. From the outside, it looked like sudden anger or a meltdown. Inside, it was the aftershock of being unheard and unseen for too long. My body was discharging the weight of repeated invalidation, the same weight it had carried since childhood. Without images, I once thought this made me irrational or too sensitive. But now I see it clearly. These were emotional flashbacks. My nervous system remembered neglect and dismissal, and the feeling survived even when the storyline was gone. The philosophical puzzle philosophers of mind often ask, what is a memory? If memory is only images and stories, then emotional flashbacks seem to defy definition. But if memory is also felt states, then emotional flashbacks are among the purest memories we have, unmediated by story, raw in their truth. Augustine once described memory as the present of things past. Emotional flashbacks embody this. They are not recollections of the past. They are the past present again. Understanding the physiology of emotional flashbacks matters because it reframes the experience. Instead of asking, what's wrong with me? We can ask, what is my body remembering? The amygdala's alarm, the hippocampus's falter, cortisol's flood, the vagus nerve's shift. Together they create the storm of feeling without pictures. And knowing this, we can begin to meet emotional flashbacks not with shame, but with compassion. Because the body isn't betraying us, it's trying to keep us safe, the only way it knows how. Scenario: sudden despair in ordinary conversation. Picture this. You're sitting with a friend, a partner, maybe even a colleague. The room is calm. The conversation is ordinary, perhaps about dinner plans, work, or a passing remark about the news. Nothing in the content of the words seems threatening. And then, without warning, despair wells up inside you. A heaviness lands in your chest. Your eyes sting. It feels as though the floor has dropped away, though nothing has actually happened. This is the lived experience of an emotional flashback. The trigger hiding in plain sight often, the spark is subtle. A certain word, a tone of voice, even a shift in posture. Something small touches an old nerve. The amygdala doesn't care whether it makes sense. It recognizes a pattern from the past and sets off alarms. It might be the sigh that sounds like an old dismissive parent. The way someone avoids eye contact recalls neglect. A phrase that echoes the cruelty of a bully. These microcues are enough. The body leaps into survival mode. The descent into despair, step by step. What happens in the body when despair floods in? Run. Amygdala fires. The alarm goes off, signaling threat. 2. Cortisol surge. The HPA axis releases stress hormones. Heart rate shifts and blood rushes away from digestion. 3. Hippocampus falters. No image arises because the event was never fully sequenced. The feeling, abandonment, shame, terror rises raw. 4. Vagus nerve drops. Instead of fight or flight, the body may slip into dorsal vagal shutdown. Muscles slacken, voice becomes flat or silent. Eyes glaze. 5. Conscious confusion. The prefrontal cortex struggles to explain what's happening. Why do I feel so sad? Nothing bad is happening. From the outside, you may seem distant, distracted, or suddenly withdrawn. On the inside, you are drowning in a wave that has no visible source. The inner monologue of an emotional flashback. When this happens, the inner dialogue can be brutal. What's wrong with me? Why am I ruining this moment? I should be happy right now, not miserable. Shame compounds the despair. Instead of recognizing it as the body remembering, survivors often interpret it as personal weakness. This double bind, the flashback plus the self-criticism, deepens the spiral. Personal reflection, my own sudden despair for me. These moments often came in what looked like safe settings: a family dinner, a relaxed night with friends. But a phrase, a laugh, or simply feeling invisible in the group would send me crashing inside. I didn't see an image of the past. I couldn't point to a specific memory. But my body remembered what it felt like to be ignored, dismissed, or excluded. My stomach tightened, my throat closed, and I felt that familiar drop, despair without cause. I often tried to hide it, to mask the collapse. On the outside, I'd smile faintly or fall quiet. On the inside, I was battling a tidal wave. Without language for flashbacks, I thought I was simply broken. It wasn't until later that I understood. This was my nervous system reliving old wounds without pictures. How others misinterpret it. One of the cruelest aspects of emotional flashbacks is how invisible they are. Without obvious triggers or dramatic outbursts, others may misinterpret what they see. A partner might think you're disinterested. A friend might assume you're bored or distracted. A colleague might see you as aloof or cold. Because the flashback is internal, it rarely earns compassion. Instead, survivors face judgment or distance at precisely the moment they need connection most. The philosophical lens, emotion without story. This scenario also raises a philosophical question. Can emotion exist without narrative? Emotional flashbacks suggest it can. Despair arrives pure, stripped of context. It is, in a sense, emotion in its rawest form, sensation without explanation. Some traditions view this as closer to the truth. In Buddhism, feelings vedana arise and pass like the weather, without an inherent story. From this perspective, emotional flashbacks are storms of remembered weather, still passing through the body even decades later. Neuroception at work. Stephen Porges' concept of neuroception helps explain why these hidden triggers strike. Neuroception is the nervous system's unconscious scanning of safety and danger. Unlike perception, it doesn't require conscious awareness. In the conversation scenario, neuroception picks up a micro-cue, tone, gesture, energy, and tags it as unsafe. The body shifts state instantly. You don't choose despair. Despair chooses you. Cultural silence around invisible flashbacks. In many cultures, especially Western ones, emotions without a clear cause are dismissed. Get over it. You're too sensitive. Don't make a big deal out of nothing. This cultural silence compounds the trauma. Survivors learn not only to endure despair, but to hide it. Contrast this with indigenous traditions, where emotional storms are seen as signals from the body or ancestors. There, sudden feelings may be respected as wisdom, not weakness. The context shifts everything. Breaking the silence, naming the invisible. The first step in healing is naming. To be able to say, this is an emotional flashback. Not madness, not defect, but memory without images. Naming transforms despair from an inexplicable flaw into a survival echo. It reframes the experience from shame to compassion. An ordinary conversation can become extraordinary in its intensity when the body remembers. A tone of voice, a passing word, a glance, any of these can ignite despair that seems to appear out of nowhere. But it is not nowhere, it is the past arriving without pictures. By tracing the physiology, the amygdala's alarm, the hippocampus's falter, the vagus nerve's collapse, we see the anatomy of despair. By sharing reflections, we see its human face. And by naming it, we begin to loosen its grip. Rage is flashback. If despair is one face of the emotional flashback, rage is another. Both arrive suddenly, both overwhelm, and both confuse the survivor and those around them. But while despair pulls the body downward, rage ignites it upward, fast, hot, and often frightening. From the outside, rage may look like defiance, hostility, or even aggression. From the inside, it often feels like being hijacked by something larger than yourself. The words fly out before you can stop them. The body surges with energy. Later comes regret, shame, or exhaustion. Yet beneath it all, rage is often not about the present moment at all. It is an emotional flashback, survival energy from the past, surging without pictures. The physiology of rage flashbacks. When rage strikes, the sequence is rapid. 1. Amygdala ignition. The amygdala recognizes a cue that signals threat or injustice. 2. Sympathetic surge. The body floods with adrenaline and noradrenaline. Heart rate accelerates. Muscles are primed for action. 3. Cortisol amplification. Stress hormones heighten reactivity, narrowing attention to the perceived danger. 4. Prefrontal cortex offline. The reasoning brain goes quiet. There is no space for reflection or perspective, only reaction. 5. Discharge or explosion. The body attempts to release trapped survival energy, shouting, pacing, slamming, storming. This is the fight or flight response of the nervous system. When the past lives in the body as an unfinished fight, it re-emerges as rage in the present. Rage without story. What makes rage as a flashback confusing is the lack of a story. The intensity seems out of proportion to the situation. A small slight becomes a huge battle. A delay, a dismissal, a broken promise, any of these can open the floodgates. Because the hippocampus has failed to file the memory, the body does not connect the rage to its origin. It arrives as pure fire, unattached to narrative. Personal reflection. My anger's roots, for me, rage was never random. It was built over time. Often, I had already signaled my needs, already said I was struggling. I'd asked to be heard, to be respected, to be acknowledged. But when those pleas were ignored, when my needs were brushed aside, it became the final blow. The eruption others saw as a sudden temper was, in truth, the release of months, sometimes years of invalidation. My body remembered every dismissal, every time I was silenced or minimized. In that moment, the past collapsed into the present. Without images, I couldn't explain it. I only knew I was on fire inside. To others, it looked like defiance. To me, it was survival, a desperate attempt to reclaim dignity when words had failed. The shadow of rage flashbacks carry a deep social stigma. People fear them, label them as dangerous, or shame them for weakness. But rage is one of the most primal survival strategies. It protects the vulnerable child, the silenced adult, and the oppressed group. When society shames rage, it shames the body's fight for life. Survivors learn to bottle it up, only for it to explode later in destructive ways. The philosophical and cultural view of rage. Different traditions interpret rage differently. In ancient Greek thought, rage was often seen as divine madness, a possession by gods or fates. In Buddhist teachings, rage is one of the three poisons, but also a doorway to insight when transformed. Modern psychology sees rage as unfinished survival energy, not evil, but unintegrated. What unites these views is the recognition that rage is larger than the individual. It connects to something ancient in the human condition. Scenario: the small slight that opens the floodgates. Imagine you've spent weeks helping a colleague. One day, in front of others, they dismiss your contribution with a joke. On the surface, it is small, but suddenly rage ignites. Your voice rises, you feel heat in your chest. Everyone turns, surprised at your intensity. What happened? The amygdala tagged the dismissal as familiar. Perhaps it echoes years of being minimized by parents, teachers, or partners. The hippocampus offers no picture, only the raw effect. The body surges into fight mode. The present slight becomes a portal to the entire weight of the past. Rage as survival energy. It helps to see rage not as moral failure, but as survival energy trying to complete itself. When a child is silenced, their fight or flight response is often suppressed. The body holds that charge waiting. Decades later, a trigger opens the door, and the unfinished fight bursts through. Seen this way, rage is not about the small slight in the present. The body attempts to release unfinished business from the past. Rage in relationships, in intimate relationships, rage flashbacks are especially painful. A partner's forgetfulness, a dismissive comment, or even a sigh can trigger volcanic anger. Without awareness, this cycle damages trust and connection. But when both partners understand rage as a flashback, not a personal attack, new possibilities open. Rage becomes not a verdict on the relationship, but a signal of old wounds seeking release. The aftermath: shame and collapse after rage erupts. Many survivors feel shame. The prefrontal cortex comes back online, perspective returns, and the anger seems disproportionate. This shame can be worse than the flashback itself, leading to self-hatred or withdrawal. Yet this shame is misplaced. The rage was not irrational. It was a memory without a story. The body was not wrong. It was remembering. Cultural double standards around rage. It's also worth noting how culture shapes rage flashbacks. In some societies, anger is tolerated in men but condemned in women. In others, certain groups are stereotyped as angry while others are excused. These double standards deepen the shame survivors feel. To heal, we must see rage not through cultural prejudice, but through the lens of nervous system truth. Rage as flashback is one of the hardest experiences to live with for survivors and those around them. It arrives fast, burns hot, and leaves scars of shame. But beneath it all, it is not madness, not malice, not weakness. It is survival energy from the past, erupting without pictures. By naming it, by tracing its physiology, by reframing it as memory rather than flaw, we take the first step to transforming rage into understanding. Because even when the fire feels uncontrollable, the body is not your enemy. It is your archive. It is trying in its own way to tell the truth. Philosophical and cultural views of emotional memory. When we talk about emotional flashbacks, we usually turn to neuroscience, amygdala, hippocampus, vagus nerve, and cortisol. And this is essential. Science maps the machinery of memory and emotion. But to really understand what emotional flashbacks mean, we also need philosophy and culture, because these episodes are not only biological events, they are experiences that touch identity, time, and meaning itself. Across history, thinkers, mystics, and traditions have wrestled with the same phenomenon in different languages. The way the past remains alive in the present, the way memory can feel more real than reality, and the way emotions echo long after their supposed cause has vanished. Augustine, The Presence of Things Past. The early Christian philosopher Augustine, in his Confessions, described memory as a vast palace filled with halls of impressions, sensations, and emotions. He argued that memory was not about the past itself, but about the way the past exists in the present. He called memory the present of things past. This resonates deeply with emotional flashbacks. When despair or rage floods us without pictures, it is not the past as a historical event we experience. It is the present reality of what that past still means in our body. The memory is not stored back there. It is alive right here. In this way, Augustine anticipated what neuroscience now confirms. Memory is not a static recording. It is an active reliving. Emotional flashbacks are the ultimate proof of this. They are the past present again, raw and unstoried. Bergson, Duration and the Flow of Time. Henry Bergson, the French philosopher, offered another lens. He argued that time is not a sequence of discrete moments, like beads on a string, but a flow, which he called duration. For Bergson, memory is not about snapshots, but about continuity, where past and present interpenetrate. Emotional flashbacks are an almost literal demonstration of Bergson's insight. The despair in the present is inseparable from the despair of the past. The child's terror flows into the adult's body as if no time has passed. Trauma collapses the string of beads. All that remains is the river of feeling. Heidegger, being in temporal collapse. Martin Heidegger saw human existence as fundamentally temporal. We are always projecting ourselves into the future, carrying our past, and living in a present shaped by both. But when trauma strikes, this temporal structure can collapse. An emotional flashback is exactly this collapse. The future vanishes, no plans, no horizon, only survival. The past surges into now, not as a remembered story, but as an overwhelming mood. Heidegger called moods attunements that disclose how the world shows up for us. In flashbacks, the attunement is despair, rage, shame. The world is disclosed as unsafe, even when objectively it is not. Buddhism, samsara as trauma loop. In Buddhist thought, samsara is the endless cycle of suffering, driven by attachment, aversion, and ignorance. One could read emotional flashbacks as miniature samsaras. Each flashback is a wheel turning again, old suffering replayed, not because the external event is here, but because the imprint is still alive inside us. Meditation traditions often teach, feelings are like weather, passing clouds, not permanent truths. This maps beautifully onto emotional flashbacks. Despair arrives like a storm, but it is not the sky itself. Rage burns like lightning, but the clear space remains beyond it. To learn to sit with these storms without identifying with them is one of the central insights of mindfulness practice. Modern affect theory, feelings without story, in contemporary philosophy, affect theory, associated with thinkers like Sylvan Tompkins, Brian Masumi, and Deleuze, explores how feelings exist below language, before narrative. Affect is raw intensity, often detached from meaning. This is precisely what emotional flashbacks are. They are affected in their purest form, unstoried, pre-linguistic, bodily. The body trembles, despairs, rages without narrative attachment. From the perspective of affect theory, emotional flashbacks are not pathological. They are extreme expressions of what all emotion is, intensity without inherent story. Cross-cultural views of emotional memory. Different cultures interpret these phenomena in strikingly different ways. Indigenous traditions. Many see sudden emotions as ancestral memory, spirits speaking through the body. A wave of grief is not only yours, it may be the grief of your people, surfacing to be witnessed. African diaspora traditions, in certain spiritual practices, possession states, where emotion overtakes the body, are not seen as illness, but as a sacred connection. What Western psychology calls flashback, these traditions may call revelation. Japanese philosophy. In Zen and in aesthetics, emotions that arise without clear cause are sometimes valued as expressions of impermanence, the bittersweet poignancy of being human. These views challenge the Western framing of flashbacks as purely disorderly. They remind us that raw emotion can also be a doorway, a teacher, even a messenger. Personal integration, my inner child and the inversiverse. When I look back at my own life, especially the material I explored in my inner child was broken, I see emotional flashbacks everywhere. The mistrust that appeared without reason, the sudden meltdowns, the despair in safe rooms, all of these were the presence of things past. In the inversiverse, I spoke about corrupted heuristics, the way our subconscious programming leads us to repeat patterns. Emotional flashbacks are part of that programming. They are not conscious choices, they are echoes. Recognizing them is the first step to breaking the loop. But philosophy helps me see them differently too. They are not only wounds, they are also signs of being deeply human, of carrying history in the body. If memory were only stories, we would be flat. Because memory is also feeling, we are complex. We are alive. Skeptical debate. Are emotional flashbacks real? It's also important to face skepticism. Some psychologists argue that without images or narrative, these surges of emotion are not truly memory, but simply mood swings or dysregulation. They worry that labeling too much as trauma medicalizes ordinary emotion. This view is worth considering. Not every wave of sadness or anger is a flashback. Sometimes we are simply tired, hungry, or stressed. But neuroscience makes a strong case. When cortisol spikes, the amygdala fires, and the hippocampus fails, we see a clear mechanism for memory without pictures. Survivors know the difference too. Flashbacks feel qualitatively different from ordinary mood. They arrive with an immediacy and a certainty that sets them apart. So while skepticism grounds us, it should not erase the lived truth of survivors. Emotional flashbacks may be invisible, but they are real. Emotional flashbacks as mirrors of society philosophy also invites us to widen the lens. If individuals can have emotional flashbacks, can societies? Can a nation suddenly erupt in rage or despair without a clear present cause because of old wounds unhealed? History suggests yes. Wars, uprisings, and cultural conflicts often carry the flavor of emotional flashbacks at scale, the present charged with the past, without clear images, but with overwhelming effect. The chosen trauma of groups, as Vamik Volkan called it, resurfaces again and again. This makes emotional flashbacks not only personal phenomena, but political ones. They remind us that unhealed trauma ripples across generations. Philosophy and culture widen our view of emotional flashbacks. Augustine saw them as the presence of things past. Bergson saw them as proof that time is duration, not sequence. Heidegger saw them as moods disclosing the world as unsafe. Buddhism frames them as samsaric loops. Affect theory names them as raw intensity beneath the story. Across all of these views, one theme emerges. Emotional flashbacks are not aberrations. They are part of the human condition. They show us that memory is not only in words and pictures, but in feelings that arrive unbidden, alive in the body. To honor them is to honor our humanity. To name them is to reclaim our dignity. And to integrate them is to step toward freedom. Personal reflections, my loops in time. It's one thing to talk about emotional flashbacks in the abstract, to trace the amygdala and the vagus nerve, to quote Augustine or Bergson. It's another thing entirely to live them. For me, emotional flashbacks have not been occasional disruptions. There have been threads running through my life, sometimes visible, sometimes hidden, but always there. Childhood, silence, meltdowns, and mistrust. As a child, I lived in a constant negotiation with my nervous system. I was often overwhelmed by the world, sounds too loud, demands too high, expectations too heavy. My body carried more than it could hold, and when the pressure reached breaking point, it had only two options: collapse into silence or erupt into meltdown. There were times when I froze, going selectively mute. Adults would press me to speak, to explain myself, but I literally could not. My throat locked, my voice vanished. To them, it looked like defiance. Inside, it was a desperate attempt to survive overwhelming stress. This was an emotional flashback, not to one event, but to the repeated experience of being unsafe in expression, of knowing that words would not be heard or honored. At other times, the tension boiled over into visible meltdowns. Shouting, crying, storming off. Adults labeled it temper or defiance. What they didn't see was the long build-up, the times I tried to communicate my needs, only to be dismissed or ignored. By the time the meltdown came, it was not an explosion, but the final discharge of accumulated neglect. Looking back, I see these were loops in time. Each moment of silence or meltdown was not just about the present trigger. It was my body replaying old patterns of invalidation, old wounds of being unseen and unheard. My nervous system was still carrying the child's terror of abandonment, the child's rage at dismissal. Adolescence. Rage without pictures. In adolescence, the flashback shifted shape. I became more guarded, more mistrustful. I began to feel sudden anger, often in situations that didn't warrant it. Someone's offhand remark, a teacher's tone, even a friend's teasing could ignite me. I couldn't explain it then. I only knew that something in me reacted as if my dignity was under attack. Rage rose like a wave. I sometimes stormed out, sometimes argued fiercely, sometimes shut down completely. To others, it looked like oversensitivity. To me, it felt like survival. Now I understand, these were emotional flashbacks. The rage wasn't about the present moment. It was a memory without pictures. My body remembered every time I had been humiliated, dismissed, or made small. And when a new moment echoed that old wound, the past arrived in full force. Adulthood, relationships as mirrors of trauma. In adult relationships, emotional flashbacks became even more complicated. Intimacy has a way of opening old wounds, of surfacing the deepest patterns. There were times when mistrust surged suddenly, even with people who hadn't yet betrayed me. My body whispered, they will abandon you. They will talk behind your back. They will not truly love you. These weren't rational thoughts. They were echoes of childhood. The mistrust wasn't about the partner in front of me. It was the past alive in the present. Other times I felt despair mid-conversation. A small comment or a tone of dismissal, and suddenly my chest ached, my throat tightened, and I felt invisible all over again. Without pictures, without a story, I believed something was wrong with me. I wondered if I was simply too needy, too fragile. Then there were the moments of rage, when I had already signaled my needs, already asked to be heard, and my partner brushed them aside. That's when the old rage returned. Not sudden, but built over weeks or months of invalidation. When it finally erupted, it looked like a temper. In truth, it was survival energy discharging after being silenced too long. These loops shaped my relationships. They repeated until I recognized them for what they were, emotional flashbacks. Not failures of character, not irrational flaws, but the body remembering without images, work and social life. The group mirror flashbacks didn't only show up in family or romance. They appeared in social groups, in work settings, even in casual interactions. I remember walking into a room where tension already hung in the air. A disagreement had happened before I arrived. I didn't know the details, but I felt it in my body immediately. My stomach tightened, my shoulders hunched. I became quiet, less present. Later, when the group began gossiping, tearing apart not just the person who had left but others too, I had a moment of clarity. This isn't safe. One day they'll do the same to me. That moment was not just intuition. It was also an emotional flashback, my nervous system remembering the experience of being scapegoated, talked about behind my back, and excluded. My body knew before my mind could catch up. The body's cost of flashbacks living in these loops has taken a toll. Emotional flashbacks are not just moments of discomfort. They leave traces in the body. After meltdowns, I often felt drained for days, my nervous system struggling to reset. After despair, I carried heaviness that made ordinary tasks feel impossible. After rage, I carried shame and self-doubt that eroded my confidence. These weren't just emotional states. They were physiological collapses. Cortisol surges, vagal shutdowns, and immune dysregulation. The science matches the lived experience. Flashbacks weaken the body as much as they wound the mind. My shadow behaviors, I want to be honest here. In speaking about trauma, it's easy to paint oneself as a saint or martyr, always the victim of others' harm. But I've also seen my own shadow behaviors. I've hurt people unintentionally. I've projected mistrust where it didn't belong. I've responded with anger that frightened others. These were not conscious choices, but they were still real impacts. I carried loops into relationships and situations, and others bore the weight of them. Acknowledging this has been part of my healing. It doesn't mean blaming myself for trauma that wasn't mine to carry, but it does mean taking responsibility for how the loops echo outward. It means breaking cycles not just for myself, but for those around me. Self-development and spiritual awakening. My journey of self-development and spirituality gave me a new language for these loops. Through reading, reflection, and practice, I came to see flashbacks as mirrors, not just of the past, but of what needed healing now. I realized that when I healed, I wasn't only helping myself. Because of mirror neurons, because of the interconnectedness of human nervous systems, my healing rippled outward. When I chose compassion over rage, presence over shutdown, I wasn't only freeing myself. I was creating space for others to feel safer too. This is why self-love matters. If I don't love myself, if I don't recognize my own worth, I project that lack outward. Others mirror it back. The loop continues. But when I root in love, I create a different loop, one that heals instead of harms. Integrating my inner child, writing my inner child was broken, was itself an act of integration. By putting words to experiences I once thought were incommunicable, I gave shape to the formless. I realized that the silence, the meltdowns, the mistrust, the despair, all of these were emotional flashbacks. Naming them brought peace. The book was also a message to others: you are not alone. If you felt emotions that seemed too much, if you've carried despair or rage that made no sense, it doesn't mean you're broken. It means your body remembers. Loops in time, loops in the body looking back. I see my life as a series of loops. Not linear progress, not simple healing, but circles. Each time a flashback arrived, it brought me back to the same wound. Each time I had a choice, to repeat or to integrate. Sometimes I repeated, caught in shame or rage. Other times I glimpsed integration, the ability to say, this is not madness, this is memory. Slowly the loops loosened. Slowly the circles widened into spirals. This is what emotional flashbacks have taught me. Healing is not about erasing the past. It is about recognizing when the past is here again and choosing to meet it with compassion instead of confusion. These are my loops in time, the silences, the meltdowns, the rage, the mistrust, the sudden despairs. For years, I thought they were personal flaws. Now I see them as emotional flashbacks, the body remembering without pictures. By naming them, by tracing their roots, by sharing them, I reclaim them. They no longer own me. They are part of my story, but not the whole of it. And if you've recognized yourself in any of this, know that you're not broken either. You're simply carrying loops that were never given a chance to resolve. The loops are not who you are. They are echoes of what you survived, and echoes once heard can finally fade. Trauma time in relationships trauma rarely lives in isolation. The nervous system is not a closed system, it is relational. We co-regulate with others, whether in families, friendships, or romantic partnerships. When trauma loops resurface as emotional flashbacks, they not only affect the individual, they ripple outward into every relationship, often shaping dynamics in ways that are invisible until they become painfully clear. This is why emotional flashbacks are not only private experiences, they are shared realities. They become the unspoken scripts in relationships, the shadows in intimacy, the background noise in groups. Understanding how trauma time plays out in relationships helps us see why some patterns repeat and why healing often requires not just self-awareness, but relational awareness too. The nervous system is contagious. Neuroscience tells us that human beings are wired for resonance. Mirror neurons fire not only when we act, but when we see another act. Polyvagal theory shows that the vagus nerve is tuned to cues of safety or threat in others' voices, faces, and bodies. What this means is simple but profound. When your nervous system shifts, the people around you feel it. If you collapse into despair, your partner's body reads it, even if they don't consciously register why. If rage surges in you, your friend's nervous system may tighten defensively. If mistrust clouds your mood, others may mirror it unconsciously. This resonance can be beautiful when rooted in safety, shared laughter, mutual calm, and the warmth of belonging. But when trauma loops drive the resonance, relationships become echo chambers of fear and pain. Repetition compulsion, the return of the old script. Sigmund Freud coined the term repetition compulsion to describe the tendency of trauma survivors to recreate situations resembling their original wound. A child abandoned may find themselves drawn to distant partners. A child shamed may choose friends who ridicule them. At first, this seems irrational, even masochistic. Why would anyone repeat pain? But the nervous system is trying to resolve what was left unfinished. The body remembers the loop and unconsciously seeks situations that might finally complete it. The tragedy is that without awareness, the loop repeats instead of resolving. In relationships, this compulsion is magnified. Survivors often find themselves reliving the same dynamics with different people, baffled at why they are always drawn to the wrong ones. It is not a choice in the rational sense. It is trauma time at work. Personal reflection, loops in my relationships. In my own life, I've seen these loops play out repeatedly. I found myself drawn to people who mirrored the same dynamics I knew in childhood, people who dismissed my needs, who invalidated my feelings, who turned cold or gossiped behind my back. At first, I believed I was simply unlucky. Later, I realized my nervous system was unconsciously scanning for familiarity. It wasn't looking for safety, it was looking for the known, and the known was invalidation. In those relationships, my emotional flashbacks were constant. A partner's dismissive shrug wasn't just a shrug, it was my body reliving years of dismissal. A friend's betrayal wasn't just one betrayal, it was every betrayal echoing at once. The intensity was overwhelming, not because of the present moment alone, but because the past was present too. It took years of reflection to see that I wasn't broken for feeling so deeply. I was carrying loops into relationships. The challenge was not to suppress them, but to recognize them for what they were. Trauma time bleeding into now. How partners inherit each other's loops. Relationships are systems. When one partner is pulled into a flashback, the other is affected. This can happen in several ways. Enmeshment. The partner feels responsible for fixing or soothing the flashback, often losing themselves in the process. Defensiveness. The partner feels attacked by the intensity of the emotion and withdraws, which can trigger further abandonment fears. Mirroring. The partner unconsciously mirrors the flashback, escalating conflict instead of calming it. Avoidance. The partner distances themselves emotionally, creating further cycles of mistrust. Over time, partners can begin to carry each other's loops. A survivor's despair may trigger the partner's own old wounds of helplessness. A survivor's rage may awaken the partner's childhood fear of conflict. Loops stack on loops until both are caught in a time collapse. Friendships and social groups. It's not only in romantic partnerships that trauma time shows up. Friendships and groups are equally fertile ground for loops. A friend failing to reply to a message may trigger feelings of abandonment that far exceed the situation. A social group excluding you from an outing may echo schoolyard humiliations. A colleague's criticism may resurface parental shaming. In groups, loops often play out collectively. Gossip, scapegoating, and coldness are ways groups unconsciously project and replay their own unresolved traumas. And just as in personal flashbacks, the intensity often feels disproportionate. That's because it isn't just about the present slight. It's about centuries of accumulated patterns encoded in nervous systems. Why love doesn't feel safe. One of the most painful aspects of trauma time in relationships is how safety itself can feel unsafe. When a partner offers genuine love, a survivor's nervous system may not know what to do with it. The amygdala scans for danger. The hippocampus has few safe memories to file. The body mistrusts the calm, waiting for the shoe to drop. Instead of joy, safety triggers suspicion. Instead of ease, love triggers fear. This is why many survivors sabotage healthy relationships. It's not because they don't want love. It's because their nervous systems don't recognize love as familiar. The familiar was chaos. The familiar was neglected. Trauma time teaches the body to brace, even in moments of peace. Philosophical insight. The other, as mirror philosophy, has long recognized that the other person is a mirror. Emmanuel Levinas spoke of the face of the other as a call to responsibility. Martin Buber wrote of the I-thou relationship as a meeting of presence. In trauma, this mirror becomes distorted. The other no longer reflects only themselves. They reflect your past. You see not only your partner or friend, but every betrayer, every abandoner, every silencer. This is what makes relationships so intense for trauma survivors. The present is always doubled. You are with this person, but you are also with the ghosts they unknowingly resemble, breaking the loops, awareness, and communication. The good news is that loops are not destiny. Awareness creates choice. When survivors learn to recognize emotional flashbacks, they can name them instead of unconsciously acting them out. In relationships, this means learning to say, I'm having a flashback. This isn't only about you. My body is remembering. Such honesty transforms the dynamic. Instead of blame, there is transparency. Instead of confusion, there is clarity. For partners, friends, and groups, the task is compassion. To understand that what looks irrational is actually memory. To hold space without judgment. To resist the urge to minimize or fix, and instead to witness. Personal reflection. Learning to name the loops. For me, the turning point was when I learned to name what was happening. Instead of erupting in rage or collapsing in despair, I began to say, this feels bigger than the moment. My body is remembering something. At first, it felt awkward, even embarrassing. But over time, it changed everything. Relationships became less about reenacting the past and more about building trust in the present. Friends began to understand my silences. Partners began to see my needs without defensiveness. Naming the loops didn't erase them, but it softened their grip. It gave me a measure of freedom. Trauma time in relationships is one of the most challenging aspects of healing. It explains why survivors repeat patterns, why partners feel overwhelmed, and why friendships fracture under invisible weight. It shows us that love is not always simple, because love is haunted by memory. But it also shows us the path forward. By recognizing loops, by naming flashbacks, and by holding compassion, relationships can become places of healing instead of repetition. Because just as trauma is transmitted through relationships, so too is healing. Safety is contagious, compassion resonates, and love, when patient and persistent, can teach the nervous system a new loop, one rooted not in fear but in trust. Collective trauma as historical time collapse. When we talk about trauma, it's easy to think only of the individual nervous system, a child overwhelmed by neglect, an adult triggered into despair, a survivor collapsing into rage. But trauma does not end at the boundary of the self. It is carried in families, transmitted across generations, and embedded in societies. Just as an individual can fall into an emotional flashback without pictures, so too can an entire community, a culture, or a nation. This is what I call collective trauma as historical time collapse. Just as the amygdala ignites when an old wound is touched in an individual, so societies ignite when certain symbols, events, or narratives press on collective scars, the body of a culture remembers. And when that memory resurfaces, it can overwhelm the present, flooding politics, relationships, and identity with unresolved echoes of the past. the science of collective memory, before we turn to examples, it helps to see how neuroscience offers metaphors for society. The hippocampus, which sequences events in individuals, has its social analogue in collective histories, textbooks, rituals, and monuments. When these are distorted or suppressed, societies lose their ability to place trauma in context. The wound remains raw. The amygdala, scanning for threat in the individual, has its analogue in mass media and cultural narratives. Stories that trigger fear of outsiders, of invasion, of betrayal ignite collective alarms. The prefrontal cortex, which regulates and contextualizes, might be seen as the institution of dialogue, philosophy, and law. When these weaken, regulation collapses and raw effect drives action. From this perspective, collective trauma isn't metaphorical. It is embodied in the social nervous system. Example 1. Partition and intergenerational fear. Take the partition of India in 1947. Millions were displaced, hundreds of thousands killed. Families were uprooted overnight, and neighbors became enemies. The trauma was not just personal, it was civilizational. Today, generations later, descendants of partition survivors often report inherited anxieties, mistrust of neighbors, fear of betrayal, and hypervigilance around belonging. These are emotional flashbacks at scale. The body of the community remembers dislocation and violence, even in those who did not live it directly. Psychologists studying epigenetics have found that trauma markers can indeed pass through generations, altering stress hormone regulation in descendants. The science mirrors what survivors already know. Trauma echoes down the line. Example 2. The legacy of slavery. In the African diaspora, the legacy of slavery is a textbook case of collective trauma. The chains may be gone, but the scars remain in the nervous systems of communities. Hypervigilance in the face of authority, mistrust of institutions, deep wounds around dignity and belonging, these are not irrational. They are the body remembering centuries of dehumanization. What makes this collective trauma particularly painful is denial. When societies refuse to acknowledge the depth of historical wounds, survivors are forced into double pain, carrying the memory while being told it should no longer matter. This is akin to gaslighting at scale. Flashbacks without images show up as sudden waves of rage during police encounters, despair at systemic injustice, or mistrust of medical systems. These are not random emotions. They are survival echoes of the collective body. Example 3. The Holocaust and chosen trauma. The psychoanalyst Vamik Volkan coined the term chosen trauma to describe the waves hold on to specific historical wounds as central to identity. For Jewish communities, the Holocaust remains not only a history but a living wound. Survivors' grandchildren often report dreams, anxieties, and emotions tied to camps they never saw. Collective memory here functions like an emotional flashback, not visual images, but visceral fear, mistrust, and grief alive in the body. What makes this powerful is how it shapes politics. Collective trauma influences decisions about safety, belonging, and borders. The past collapses into the present, and the emotional weight of survival colors every choice. Example 4. The Armenian genocide and silenced memory. Where trauma is denied, the wound deepens. For over a century, many governments refused to recognize the Armenian genocide of 1915. For Armenians, this created not only grief but the pain of erasure. This silence functions like dissociation at a collective level. Without recognition, the trauma loops endlessly. Survivors and descendants feel despair and rage resurface, often triggered by political denial. Again, this is a flashback without pictures, grief that overwhelms, untethered from narrative because the narrative itself is suppressed. Example 5. Indigenous peoples and cultural loss. For indigenous peoples across the world, colonization brought not only physical violence but cultural annihilation, languages lost, rituals banned, and children taken into residential schools. The trauma was systematic, generational. Today, sudden waves of despair, addiction epidemics, and cycles of violence in many indigenous communities are often framed as social problems. But through the lens of trauma, they are collective flashbacks. The nervous system of the community remembers loss, even if individuals cannot name it in images. At the same time, indigenous traditions often carry wisdom about how to heal through ceremony, ritual, and communal storytelling. These practices serve as grounding tools, temporal anchors that remind the body. Now is not then. Example 6. Post-conflict societies. In societies emerging from war, Bosnia, Rwanda, and Northern Ireland, collective trauma manifests in sudden reignitions of hostility. A song, a parade, or a political speech can trigger despair or rage that feels wildly disproportionate to the present. But it is not about the present. It is the past alive again. Here, trauma time shapes not only personal identity but national politics. Leaders can manipulate flashbacks, stoking fear for power. Or communities can find ways to transform them, creating truth and reconciliation processes that serve as collective grounding rituals. The philosophy of historical time collapse philosophers remind us that time is never simple. Nietzsche spoke of the eternal return, the idea that patterns repeat endlessly. In trauma, this is not a metaphor but a lived reality. When societies replay old wounds, when communities erupt in rage at present events that echo historical injuries, they are caught in eternal return. The past is not past, it is always circling back, demanding recognition. Walter Benjamin, the Jewish philosopher, wrote that history is not a linear progression, but a storm blowing wreckage at our feet. Survivors of collective trauma know this storm intimately. Every new crisis carries the debris of what came before. Personal reflection, feeling the collective body for me. Recognizing collective trauma has been humbling. I used to think of my nervous system as my private struggle. But the more I've reflected, the more I see how my despair, my mistrust, my rage are connected to wider currents. When I feel fear in crowds, it isn't only mine. It echoes with generations who knew what crowds could mean. Persecution, exile, violence. When I feel mistrust of authority, it isn't only my personal story. It resonates with communities gaslit and silenced for centuries. This doesn't diminish my personal pain. It situates it. It shows me that healing isn't only an individual task. It is collective. When I ground myself, when I learn to name my flashbacks, I am also resisting cultural loops that thrive on fear, new ways of healing collective loops. If trauma time collapses history into now, how can societies reclaim the present? Truth-telling, honest acknowledgement of historical wounds functions like bringing hippocampal sequencing back online. Naming collapses into narrative. Ritual and ceremony, shared practices anchor communities in the present, reminding bodies that survival is here. Education, teaching history fully and fairly contextualizes trauma, preventing its dissociation into silence. Art and story, literature, film, and song carry collective memory in ways that transform despair into meaning. Interpersonal healing. Each time survivors name flashbacks and create compassion in relationships, they weaken the collective loop too. Collective trauma is the emotional flashback of cultures. It is despair without images, rage without a clear story, mistrust that flows through generations. From partition to slavery, from genocide to colonization, the wounds of history remain alive in bodies and communities. When we understand trauma time at this scale, we see that healing is not only personal but political, not only individual but cultural. To reclaim the present, we must face the past, not to remain in it, but to honor it, to sequence it, to release it. Because just as individuals are haunted by loops until they name them, so too are societies. And just as individuals can heal by recognizing the body's memory, so too can cultures. Healing collective trauma begins with the courage to say, this is not weakness. This is a memory, and now is not then. Practices for reclaiming the present. If emotional flashbacks are the body's way of collapsing time, past despair or rage surging into the present without images, then healing requires teaching the nervous system that now is not then. This is not about erasing memory, which is impossible, but about creating anchors in the present strong enough to hold us when old storms arise. The good news is that while trauma collapses time, the body also carries the tools for restoration. Through grounding, orienting, journaling, and ritual, we can begin to reclaim trust in our sensations, learning that feelings are real but not always reliable guides to the present truth. Grounding, anchoring in the body now grounding techniques bring attention back to the present through sensation. Some are simple. 5 senses check in. Name 5 things you can see, 4 you can touch, 3 you can hear, 2 you can smell, and 1 you can taste. This recruits the prefrontal cortex, reminding the brain of the present environment. Feet on the floor. Press feet firmly into the ground, feeling gravity hold you. Trauma lifts us into fight flight or collapses us into freeze. Grounding restores connection with stability. Temperature shifts. Holding ice, drinking warm tea, or splashing cold water can shock the nervous system back into present awareness. These may sound small, but they are powerful. When the amygdala is firing, the body needs simple, sensory anchors to interrupt the spiral. Orienting, teaching the body safety orienting is the practice of showing the nervous system that the present environment is safe. Trauma often traps us in hypervigilance, scanning endlessly for danger. Orienting flips the script. Instead of scanning for threat, we scan for calm. Look around slowly. Let the eyes sweep the room, naming what feels safe, a lamp, a picture, a window. This reminds the amygdala that danger is not imminent. Notice exits and entrances. Survivors often feel trapped. Locating doors and windows reassures the body that it has choice. Soften the gaze. Trauma sharpens vision into tunnel focus. Relaxing the gaze broadens perception, signaling the vagus nerve that the threat has passed. Orienting retrains the nervous system to distinguish past danger from present safety. Body journaling, making the invisible visible flashbacks without images, are hard to process because they lack a story. Journaling helps translate raw sensation into meaning. Instead of writing only about thoughts, body journaling asks, where in my body did I feel it? What did the sensation remind me of? What did I need but not receive? Over time, patterns emerge. The stomach ache in conflict may trace back to childhood shame. The chest tightness in intimacy may echo parental coldness. By mapping sensations, we sequence memory, bringing hippocampal order to amygdala chaos. Temporal anchors, rituals of now. Because trauma distorts time, healing often requires explicit temporal anchors. Rituals mark beginnings and endings, reminding the body that time moves forward. Daily check-ins, a morning or evening ritual, lighting a candle, stretching, journaling one line, signals continuity. Seasonal rituals, celebrating cycles of nature teaches the nervous system that time unfolds beyond trauma. Relational anchors, agreeing on rituals with a partner or group, weekly dinners, shared walks creates embodied reminders of stability. These practices are not luxuries, they are nervous system medicine. Ritual and culture, reclaiming the collective now cultures have long known that ritual heals time. Indigenous ceremonies, African drumming circles, Buddhist chanting, and Christian liturgies all function as temporal anchors. They remind communities, we are here together now. For survivors of collective trauma, these practices are essential. They do what the individual nervous system cannot do alone, hold memory while also marking the present. Personal reflection, my anchors of now. In my own journey, practices like these have been lifelines. When despair hit without images, I learned to sit with my journal, tracing sensations into words. At first, the writing was chaotic. Over time, patterns emerged. I saw how the same tightness in my chest appeared every time I felt dismissed. Naming it gave me power. When rage threatened to overwhelm, I learned to ground with my feet on the floor, to remind myself, I am here, I am safe, this is not childhood. Sometimes I failed, sometimes the fire still burst through, but each attempt built new pathways, teaching my body that safety was possible. Ritual, too, has become a compass. Daily routines, small acts of intention, even lighting a candle before reflection, these anchor me in time. They tell my nervous system, today is today, not yesterday. None of this makes flashbacks disappear, but it changes the relationship. Instead of being dragged helplessly into the past, I now have tools to stand in the present. Practices for reclaiming the present are not about perfection. They are about small acts of resistance against traumatic times. Each grounding breath, each orienting glance, each journal entry is a declaration. I am here now. Over time, these practices retrain the nervous system, teaching it that feelings are real but not always true, that sensations are valid but not always accurate to the present. Slowly the loops loosen. Slowly the body trusts again. Because healing does not mean never having flashbacks. It means having flashbacks and knowing what they are. It means remembering that now is not then. We've travelled far in this episode, from the physiology of emotional flashbacks without images, through despair and rage, into philosophy, personal reflection, and collective history. We've seen how feelings can arrive without story, how the body remembers without pictures, and how these loops can shape both intimate relationships and whole societies. If there is one lesson to carry forward, it is this. Emotional flashbacks are not a weakness. They are memories in their rawest form. They are the nervous system trying to protect, even when the danger is gone. To recognize them is to reclaim dignity. To meet them with compassion is to begin healing. In our next episode, episode 14, Childhood Conditioning, we'll turn to the roots of it all. We'll explore how early environments wire the nervous system, how attachment, punishment, and neglect become embodied scripts. We'll look at how a teacher's harsh tone can replay parental fear, and we'll bring in neurodivergence, autism, and ADHD as case studies of heightened sensitivity to conditioning. This will take us deeper into the foundation of loops and into the earliest imprints of body memory. Until then, you've been listening to The Body Knows. Take care of yourselves, listen gently to your body, and remember, healing is not linear, but every step matters. James Miller.